We are back deep in New Mexico's Chaco Canyon. This is Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon. This megalithic ancient ruin was constructed and originally inhabited by the ancestral Puebloan people about 1,000 years ago. And deep within the walls of Pueblo Bonito lies the mysterious Room 33. When I first heard about Room 33 in Pueblo Bonito, I really couldn't believe what I was hearing. Right, was this the group that had extra digits?
So the Park Service isn't allowed to talk about the burials, right. But so they have found them here, right?
Yeah. I have a Hopi friend, had his DNA done and discovered that it matched the DNA of the two super guys in room 33. And most of his DNA is Mayan.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
So that says a lot, doesn't it?
It does.
And it's very controversial. He got caught in a big controversy, incredible controversy.
Was there any unusual features with the elite burials at all?
Well, there was a lot of disparity. One of them was said to have filed teeth. And of course, when you think about stone buildings on the order of Chaco, you think of Mexico. Then there are the dark stories.
This may be the most mysterious room in all of the Desert Southwest's ancient ruins. If this information is true, they're going to have to rewrite the history books.
The only thing that's certain is that this is a really big deal. I think a lot of the answers are here.
Nobody even knows this is here.
They have evidence, and they dug down and they found proof.
Our culture now, with all of our technology and advancements, we could not replicate this.
As we look for the truth of what was all of this for. Why did they build these? I'm Tom.
And I'm Cheri.
And we're EnjoyTheJourney.Life. We are continuing our Chaco Canyon series in New Mexico. We filmed there for weeks, including interviewing local experts, including an archaeologist. So be sure to subscribe for our full Chaco Canyon series, and you can catch the videos we've already released with the link in the description and this code right here.
100 years ago, when archaeology was really just people who went out and dug stuff up
Without the
any
regulations and control.
And, you know,
the government had to get their hands in
they
it.
had a lot of exciting adventures. They also damaged a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
They also took a lot of things and sold them or gave them to private collectors, and so we don't have access to any of that stuff for research purposes. People were really, really disrespectful about human remains in the past.
Oh,
And
that's too
so
bad.
that's one of the reasons why today a lot of the tribes require the Park Service to not talk about burials
Yeah.
because they don't want people to try and find them or cause more destruction.
So the Park Service isn't allowed to talk about the burials,
Right.
but so they have found them
yeah.
here, right? Okay.
Each site has people buried in it.
Okay.
They're what we call high status burials, which means they have a whole lot of grave goods with them. And very often it's just one person in a room or in a designated area with their stuff. And so that's an expensive method, especially during times of drought. You know, if there's a drought going on and you bury someone and you give them clothes and tools and food and water, and then you seal up the room and never go in it again, that means that that person is either incredibly important to your group or very wealthy and can afford that, because during a drought, the living are the ones who need all of those things.
A huge discovery in Chaco Canyon and Pueblo Bonito was the mysterious Room 33. Well, so you mentioned this Room 33. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, it was where they found the high status burials.
Okay.
Now, the first archaeological dig was Richard Wetherill and George Pepper, the Hyde expedition. The Hyde brothers backed Richard Wetherill before Chaco on some of his archaeological digs. I don't know how much you know about Richard Wetherill and all.
I have heard his name. I know he was killed out there over
That's
a
right.
disagreement, and
Yeah.
his grave is out there.
That's correct. That's correct. It's quite the story. I wish there was a movie made of it. I have it written in my head. I even have some of the cast members.
Oh, wow.
That's another story. Anyway.
Okay.
Anyway, so he had guided a family out there who was interested. They were itinerant musicians, and they had heard about Bonito and wanted to go see it. And they encountered Richard Wetherill up in Mancos, where he had his ranch, and he was taking people to these places and doing tours. The places at Mesa Verde that he is given credit for having discovered or rediscovered. Anyway, they said, we heard about this Bonito, would you take us down there? He'd never been here, but he brought him down, 1895. And he went back to the Hyde brothers back east and said, hey, you backed me before, this is really something. There's this, he described it to them and all of that. Just Bonito, you know, he wanted to dig Bonito. And so they sent him out here, but they wanted it to be a legitimate dig. So they went to the American Museum of Natural History, and there they were given a young archaeologist just out of school, as I understand it, in his 20s, never been out west, George Pepper. The old man, Putman, was too old to come out, but he sent this kid out. He and Richard didn't get along really well, but for 4 years they dug in Bonito, and one of the first rooms was in that old section of Bonito, Room 33. And there's a lot of description of that dig by Pepper. He went into the room. One description of it is its width and length and all is about the size of a queen bed, but it was a whole story. And it was all covered, of course. And so when he went in, he had to use candles, and he had to have a handkerchief with, wetted across his face. He could last in there 15, 20, 30 minutes before he had to be dragged out, before he started coughing himself to death. And he was trying to measure everything and write it all down. And he does that, and he presents his paper. You can read about it. It's his account of that. Okay, and in that he found 2 burials that were almost intact, high status. 2 things can be said about that particular cache, burial, whatever you want to call it, repository of something, that sound contradictory. More turquoise was found in that room with those burials that have been found in the rest of the prehistoric Southwest archaeological sites put together.
Wow.
The second statement, as they understood the importance of turquoise in Chaco, the vast majority, probably 99% of it, of the turquoise that came into the canyon was worked, turned into its product, and sent out. Whatever they called Chaco, it might have been Turquoise Canyon, whatever they called turquoise. Anyway, those high status burials gave rise to the whole speculation that these great houses were like palaces for kings, whatever, big time people. And there were other small houses, but there wasn't as much evidence for those because they were totally covered over. They're single story. The small houses mostly on the south side. But there was some of that was exposed so that they knew there were these small houses. And so it was easy to say, okay, the rich people lived over here, in the big palace, they were the kings or whatever, and the poor people lived over there. So that was one way to think about it. But as things progressed over time, over the long haul, they found not very many burials, and no burials that looked like these 2 in this one room. Never found that again. Now, we're not talking just Bonito now. We're talking Chaco. 60, 70,000 square miles. There's never been found another burial like that. There's been things that have been found extravagant in their way, but nothing quite like those 2 burials.
Yeah, you said that there was more in that one room for turquoise than has been found
in the rest of the prehistoric Southwest archaeological sites put together.
That is
yeah,
that's insane.
Yeah.
Was there any unusual features with the elite burials at all?
Well, there was a lot of disparity.
Okay.
In truth, yeah. And when people say, what were the burials like? Well, I just described those 2, and they were fancy, carefully laid out. But it's also said that numbers differ, but anywhere from another dozen to maybe 8 or 9 burials in that room. They were just disarticulated bones thrown in. Now, what story do you write up about that? You've got way down below one of the high status burials. Now, here's the story though. When Pepper did his study and wrote up his paper based on his measurements, he gave a certain narrative. Steve Plog, who's one of the people that did the DNA study, took his measurements and put them on a holographic depiction of that room. The measurements did not comply with Pepper's conclusions, his written description of what he was finding. He just assumed the 2 burials were together. Well, they were 3 feet apart. They were put in at different times.
Okay.
So little things like that. It wasn't that he was totally wrong. It was just that if you look at his data, which is where he got his conclusions, it doesn't match somebody else looking at the same data.
Right.
So is one of the people wrong, or is it just that his subjective experience about going into that room and making those measurements is very different from another person just taking the objective measurements and coming to a different conclusion? So I don't know what it all means. But anyway, it's a complicated story.
Right.
With these disarticulated bones thrown in, you don't just, how do you explain that? It could be explained in a variety of ways. it could be a time thing, because the first burial was put in when that room was very new, that one way down below. And I can't remember if the second one was put in about the same time. I'm assuming it was. I think I would know, I would remember if it were real different. But anyway, it could be that the bones later that were all on top just thrown in, well, it might have been 2 or 3 generations later, and who cared about what the old people cared about anyway? You know, you could make up that story, you know. You could make up almost any story.
I've heard that's part of the disagreement, controversy around Chaco, is because different tribes, maybe different groups came in and then left, that when you find something, it's like a snapshot in time, but
Yeah.
it doesn't mean it was that way 100 years earlier.
Exactly. Bonito was a building that was that took longer to structure, to put together, than the United States has been in existence.
That's a great way to say that.
Because look at the changes the United States has gone through.
Right.
And we're all in whiplash right now, so, you know, it's like, yeah. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, and, you know, people like Steve Lexon, who have had a long haul in Chaco, put together changes that he sees in the architecture and suggests that that could be reflective of changes in their social order also. You know, different groups coming in and gaining supremacy, whatever. Then there are the dark stories. You can't discount them.
Right.
You know, there are some things in Chaco that they were probably pretty horrible. The Hopi have said that they were given, this is how they put it, they were given their ceremonies in Chaco. They were taken to Chaco and taught the ceremonies so that they could then go to where they are today.
I've heard it described as almost a university.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that often comes up too, a place where people came to learn. You know?
And you said that, and I, maybe kind of even going back further, that Chaco was inhabited even before they built all of the great houses.
Yeah, very much so. It was a rich place before, at least for the standards of the day. Were those the people that then started building above ground? What would cause them to do that? And most people think, and this is probably true, that we're talking about ideas coming from outside. And of course, when you think about stone buildings on the order of Chaco, you think of Mexico.
Right.
And we know from cacao and macaws and parrots and copper bells, all these things that we know came from the South. So they really had a connection to the South, no question. I have a Hopi friend, and this is an extraordinary story, so I won't tell you his name. He had his DNA done.
Okay.
Now, he wasn't raised Hopi, but he came out of the Hopi village and then returned. And when I met him, I think it was about that time that he and his wife just moved to Hopi. It was 2 years after their marriage. I met them in Chaco my first year. But he had his DNA done and discovered that it matched the DNA of the 2 super guys in room 33.
Oh.
And because that DNA had just been done, and it's very controversial, he got caught in a big controversy, incredible controversy, because they did not do the tribal consultations. Both the researchers themselves, some of whom I know, and the institutions that they were doing this under the auspices of, none of them did any consultation with the tribes about doing DNA on bones from the ancient burials, all of which should have been repatriated in 1990 after NAGPRA, but wasn't, and now they're getting caught on that.
Okay.
So, you know, it's an amazing story when you think about it. But anyway, and most of his DNA is Mayan.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
So that says a lot, doesn't it?
It does.
exactly what it says now. You know, there are all kinds of stories among the people's origin stories here, and they're not consistent. There are some overlays, of course, but even in a single tribe, that's a hard word because it doesn't really work. But like, if you call Hopi a tribe, you've got several different villages. They don't all think the same. There's not a Hopi worldview. You know, there are Hopi worldviews. You know, and anyway. And so, coming from the south, they talk about going all the way down to the tip of South America. Some of the traditions of the Hopi, going all the way down, and going down today and recognizing rock art. And then they came back to where they are now. Now it's easy to, you know, that's quite a story. And if you're going to put that story forth in the Western world, you better have evidence for it. And of course, all they have are their oral traditions. When I say all they have, that's the most important to them.
Right.
And that's where NAGPRA is difficult for anyone to accept, either whether you're on the indigenous side or you're on the scientific side, because it tries to take into account everything. Oral tradition, ethnography, that sort of thing, has the same weight as archaeological hard evidence. Has the same weight. I don't remember now the details, but I think there are like 11 criteria that are all weighed, and they all have the same weight. You know, and from an archaeological point of view, they want that archaeology to have the heaviest weight, you know, and, you know, to have the day. Everything else,
science,
maybe a little peripheral
science
stuff.
doesn't want all the stories, right?
No.
Yeah.
Except that the smart scientists do, because they understand that there's something more, you know, about this. After 100 years, I mean, of by the standards of each era, pretty intense study in Chaco. 100 years, and we still can't answer basic questions, you know. And so the different researchers have their, you know, their line of sight, and if they didn't have their line of sight, their focus wouldn't give us the depth of study that they do give us. But it also tends to narrow their worldview. So the ones that take more into account the natives, and by, you know, even by some accounts, Neil Judd in the 20s, he talked to the older people who he was, you know, amongst, who were all the natives, and they told him a lot of things, and, you know, he listened and wrote down a lot of things. You know, some of it was kind of funny. He said there was an old man there who never went into Bonito, and Judd asked him one day, he said, "You never go inside, you know, I mean, you work out here, but, you know, you never go in." And he said, the old man said, "There's a big snake in there, it'll eat me." And Judd, you know, now what the man meant by that, I don't know, and was he pulling his leg, or, you know, we don't know. We only know that that's what Judd said, the man said to him, and so Judd's response was, "Well, I go in there all the time, I've never seen this big snake." And the old man responded, "That's because you're white." You know, he writes that down, Judd writes that down, you know. So he had conversations with people that, you know, that could be reflective of having a little more sense of, yeah, there's other worldviews here.
So kind of back to that Mesoamerican connection, do you think that's how, from the trips down to see the Mayans, the Aztecs, was that how they learned, you know, maybe how to build this way?
Or people coming up from the south, you know, it's like during the time of Chaco, just before that, the Mayans, the Chacoans predated the Aztecs. They overlap with the Mayans. It makes sense that somebody from south either came up and saw what was going on and had these new ideas. Maybe those two guys, those two burials, where the guys they showed signs of being visitors from the south. When I say they showed signs of being that, this is not conclusive. One of them was said to have filed teeth. Okay? Now,
really?
Filing teeth, besides being the sign of a Klingon, is also a very common thing from the south. So was he a visitor from the south? These two guys were taller than the average other people who've been studied in terms of the burials. I want to emphasize how I put that in terms of the other burials that have been so studied. When you think about how much of Chaco has been excavated and studied, there are different criteria for overlaying, such a parameter onto this, but you can say less than 1%.
Less than 1% of Chaco has been excavated.
Whether you're talking about just the canyon or the whole 60, 70,000 square miles, I guarantee you, less than 1% has been excavated.
Wow, I think I heard a little higher than that, but
It's not true.
but I also heard that of what's been excavated, it's like 1 million square feet of living space, potential living space.
Potential, yeah.
Wi-
But when you think about what there was.
yeah.
So, any pattern that we find within a small database, as the database grows, that pattern can get totally absorbed and changed. We may just be seeing the few that show this particular facility, and so we make an assumption that most of the places had this, because these 2 or 3 places had this that we studied. And this could be anything, the macaws, parrots, or ways they did the masonry or whatever. But we find a pattern in 2 or 3 places. And if we make the assumption that that pattern will hold, that's the big if you've only done 1%. The patterns change all the time in many ways. So we don't know.
Right.
So in terms of the great houses, the vast majority of them has not been touched.
So back to these two. So they were taller.
They were taller, probably had better nutrition.
Right. Do you suppose that if they came up from more advanced civilization, advanced building techniques, they show up and they become like maybe leaders because of their knowledge?
Yes, this is a story you can write.
Okay.
It's true. It's one of many, but you could. That how many more of those fellows there were? Well, we'd have to dig in all the great houses and find the few, other burials like that to think that, could 2 guys do it all?
Was this the right? Was this the group that had extra digits? Was that a thing?
No, not necessarily, but that was not uncommon, and as fact as I understand it, is not uncommon today.
Okay.
It's just that they're just wiped off. They just assume, bumps, they take them off, and that's it. Not a big deal. You're young. Everything's pliable, and rip it off. I don't quote me on this.
Okay.
I don't know this, but it is more common than people think.
I had heard a story that was one way they had like the ruling class were the people with the extra digits or something.
There's no evidence that I know of that overlaps that in such a way that you could make that statement.
Okay.
It's not a story. I mean, the evidence can fit that story. But it's not necessarily that. That's how I would put it. I do the best I can in my interpretation to present what we know, what we think we know, what isn't agreed upon, what is agreed upon, and all of this. I'm very cautious, and because I don't think that there is any amongst any group, scientific or indigenous, that understands Chaco. The story of Chaco hasn't been told. I don't know if it ever will be, but it hasn't been told yet. But to know that it is, I hate to use words that might sound like anthropomorphizing it, but it's a living being. It's not something that just is reflective of an ancient past. It is that, but it's also so much else, and continues to be throbbing with life today. And when the whole story of Chaco is told, it won't be ended with 1,000 years ago. That's the story we've picked up on because that's where we,
Right.
We've learned about it from that period of time.
And if you want to meet Tori in person, check out Salmon Ruins in Farmington, New Mexico. We can't wait to check it out. What did you find the most fascinating here at Pueblo Bonito and Chaco Canyon? Let us know in the comments. Again, be sure to subscribe to our channel so you catch all of our ancient ruins videos, including many more videos coming out about Chaco Canyon. There are great houses and so much more to show you. And actually, you can watch one of those videos right here.